Hi, my name is Mike Lewin and I'm running for Borough President. And in this video, I'd like to talk about housing policy, as in pretty much all my other videos. In particular, I'd like to address one common argument against new housing. So let's go with my PowerPoint, discuss this in more detail. So as you might know from seeing my other videos, the purpose of my campaign is to encourage the city to reduce zoning and allow more housing. And to really fully make the argument for new housing, I think we have to really address one very common argument against new housing. And so that argument is essentially that new housing, other than government subsidized housing, is bad because it's expensive. And the government should only allow housing that's quote unquote affordable, which as a practical matter means, because housing is expensive to build, that it really could only be built with government subsidy. So why do I reject this argument? In other words, why am I for building market rate housing as opposed to subsidized? So before I really get into my side of the argument, let me explain the other side's argument in more detail. So my argument, as I said, is less zoning, more housing. And so the main argument against more housing is quite simply that new housing is expensive. And if our real problem is that rents are too high, why should we build expensive housing? Why not just build housing that's cheaper than existing housing? Which, of course, as a practical matter, means only housing subsidized. What's wrong with this argument? Why do I reject this argument? After all, who could be against affordable housing? So to me, the argument that we shouldn't build new housing because it's expensive really overlooks the law of supply and demand. Let me explain what I mean. Right now, not that much new housing is built. So of course it's expensive. But if enough new housing was built, if we really flooded the city with a million new buildings, eventually even the new housing would be affordable, or at least much more affordable than it currently is. How do we know this? All we have to do is look at the rest of the United States. That's say in New York, because new housing is quite scarce, it's pretty expensive. But by contrast, in cities that have much more of a build, baby, build policy, new housing is much less expensive. So for example, let's take Houston. Houston has no formal zoning code. It does have some other restrictions like minimum lot sizes, so it's certainly not a complete free market, but on balance, it seems to allow a lot more new housing than New York City. I think in New York City, something like 5% of the housing supply was built after 2010, whereas in Houston, it's more like over 13%. So as a result, in Houston, even new houses cost a lot less than they do in New York. So for example, in this PowerPoint, I point you to I have a link about a house that was built in a working class part of Houston in 2017, and it cost only $120,000. Obviously in New York really doesn't buy you much of anything, and certainly not much of anything new. One other problem with the argument against new housing is that it overlooks the effect of new housing on old housing. So remember, at any given time, only a small percent of the housing supply is new. So even in Houston, 87% of the housing supply was built before 2010, which means probably over 90% was built before 2015. So in other words, if you're looking at what makes the city affordable overall, it's not so much how expensive is the new housing, it's more important to figure out how cheap is the old housing. Well, it seems to me that the more new housing that gets built, the cheaper the old housing is. Why is that? Because the demand for the old housing is decreased. This is type of decrease instead of increase, but the supply has stayed constant. So therefore, logically, the old housing should be cheaper if there's enough new housing built. So for example, let's move to another PowerPoint. Suppose that there are 100 apartments in a city and 100 households. So suddenly one of the landlords builds 20 new expensive apartments. And let's stipulate These are not subsidized apartments. They're more expensive than the old apartments. But once these 20 new expensive apartments are built, the 20 richest households in town migrate to the new apartment. So at that point, we have 800 apartments and only 80 apartments, or only 80 households that want the old apartments. In other words, you have the same supply of older apartments and lower demand. So of course, the best older apartments are going to still be snapped up by fairly well-off households. But even so, because you have more apartments than there are renters, the remaining landlords are going to be kind of in a reverse price war. That is to say, all these landlords are going to be lowering their prices to avoid being the 20 apartments who don't find tenants at all. And so the term for this in academic literature is filtering. The idea is when new housing is built in large numbers, new older housing kind of filters to people who are less affluent. So that today's market rate housing can become tomorrow's at least somewhat more affordable housing. And there's still an enormous amount of academic support for the idea of filtering. In this PowerPoint, I give you links to some academic studies, just so you're aware that they exist. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, yeah, all of this is really academic and technical. It involves these things like regression analysis the average person doesn't understand. Is there any common sense support for filtering? In other words, is there any reason to believe, without looking at all these studies, that new housing lowers prices? Well, I'll give you a couple of very oversimplified common sense reasons to believe this. Number one, in about 99% of the United States, probably every place but California, or parts of California, it's easier to build housing than it is in New York. That is to say, in most cities, there's no environmental review process slowing things down. There's no racial impact statements. There's no community board saying no. Really, in a typical city or small town, you want to get a rezoning, all you have to do is ask the city council. And guess what? In most of the United States, more housing gets built and housing is cheaper. So as I've mentioned before, in cities like Houston or Charlotte, about 10 or 50% of housing supply was built in the 2010s, opposed to 5% here. And not surprisingly, housing is cheaper in those places. Also, we have an example from our own lives. In 2020, we discovered that the law of supply and demand applies in Manhattan. And what I mean by that is many people left the city because of COVID. So that meant demand for housing went down. And guess what? Rents went down as well. And conversely, when many of these people came back, rents started to go back up again. So yes, even in Manhattan, the law of supply and demand is real. I'm a living witness to this. My last apartment in Midtown cost $3,500 a month for a 1-bedroom. And now I pay the same amount for a 2-bedroom. Actually, the net rent is even lower because I got a couple of months free. Why? Because demand for these apartments were lower because of COVID. And if you want to read some articles that are less technical than the academic studies I've cited, these are a couple of other articles that really go over some of the same points I've made, but are in a less New York specific way. Here's an article in the Atlantic, and this is a post on what's called on the Strong Towns blog. So if you want to know more, I would suggest reading these articles. So see you on the campaign trail.